All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mona Ateh. I direct the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event today with Dr. Alice Wilson and Dr. Omar El-Shahabi. Um, Dr. Wilson is Associate Professor in Anthropology at the University of Sussex in the UK. Her research interests span the political and economic anthropology of Southwest Asia and North Africa. Her work is concerned with transformations in the relationship between governing authorities and governed subjects, especially in the context of revolution and liberation movements. Her first monograph, Sovereignty in Exile, a Saharan Liberation Movement Governs, examines sovereignty through the case of the revolutionary state building and social changes in Western Sahara's liberation movement. It won the 2017 AAA Middle East Section Book Award, or was an honorable mention for that book award. And her second monograph, which we're here to discuss, is Afterlives of Revolution, Everyday Counterhistories in Southern Oman, which was published by Stanford in 2023. It examines the lasting legacies and afterlives of the liberation movement and Dhufar, Southern Oman, in order to rethink revolution, counterinsurgency, and conventional post-war histories. Afterlives of Revolution is currently under contract to be translated into Arabic with Dar Suhail in Beirut. So she'll be in conversation today with Dr. Omar Shahabi, who's Associate Professor in Global Political Economy and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Leeds. His interests lie at the intersection of labor, land, and money, with a focus on how regimes of accumulation are sustained materially and ideationally within global capitalism, situating critical political economy within a historical geographical approach. He's the author of Contested Modernity, Sectarianism, Nationalism, and Colonialism in Bahrain, and co-editor of Transit States, Labor, Migration, and Citizenship in the Gulf, among other books. He's currently on the editorial board of the International Studies Review, Contemporary Arab Affairs, and El Mustaqbal Al Arabi, and he's a founding editor of the book series Radical Histories of the Middle East by One World Publishers. Just before I hand the floor over to our guests, I want to remind you that the next event is the IMIS annual conference, Gravitating Towards the Gulf. That will be held on April 25th in the Elliott School and online in Lindner Commons. And that will feature panels on Gulf cultural diplomacy, placemaking, infrastructure, and technology in the Gulf, as well as geopolitics of the Gulf and the world. So we hope you'll join us for that conference. And I'd like to thank Christian Clinton and our work study students for making all of this possible and coordinating with our guests. Thank you so much for joining us. And Alice, I'll hand it to you, I guess, for a brief introduction to the book.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mona Atiyah, for the wonderful invitation, and Shana Marshall as well. And thank you also to Christine Clinton for all your help setting everything up. It's a very big pleasure to be in conversation with colleagues here at George Washington University. I've for a long time been indebted to the support of Alana Feltman for my research. It's wonderful that Alana is able to join us today. And there are many other inspiring colleagues in GWU. Special mention for Atiya Ahmed as another wonderful scholar of the Gulf, from whom we're taking so much inspiration. And thank you, Omar, also a great inspiration for all of us thinking critically about the Gulf. It's such an honor to be in conversation with you about the book. I'm going to just briefly introduce the book and its interventions, and I have a few images to share as well. So the question at the heart of this book is, what happens to revolutionary values, networks, and agency after a revolution meets with military defeat and authoritarian repression? And so my key finding during my ethnographic research in Oman in 2015 was that even after military defeat and ongoing authoritarian repression, former participants in a revolution can reproduce revolutionary values in later lives, and that these revolutionary values and continue to have impacts, and these lasting legacies are what the book calls afterlives of revolution. And my key argument is that in the light of these afterlives, we need to revisit debates about revolution, counterinsurgency, and their aftermaths. So I explore these concerns in the case of Dhufar, which today is the southernmost governorate of the Sultanate of Oman. You can see on this map here. And from 1965 to 1976, Dhufar was home to an anti-colonial liberation movement. It changed names several times, so for simplicity, I'll refer to it as the Front. So this anti-colonial and anti-imperial movement was fighting for political emancipation from the El Busaid sultans and their British backers, and also fighting for more broadly for social emancipation. So this image on the right here speaks to those projects of social emancipation for minoritized subjects, women, enslaved persons. But this movement faced an increasingly internationalized British-led counterinsurgency, which ultimately defeated the movement. And so telling the history of the movement has not been straightforward. So in Oman, there's been this official silence where the Omani government omits this revolution from its official narratives of national history. And meanwhile, outside Oman, some of the British veterans of that counterinsurgency, and indeed some scholars, have mythologized the counterinsurgency campaign as an allegedly model campaign that won hearts and minds, such as through welfare provision to Dafaris to win over their support. These are problematic approaches for various reasons. They're either erasing or legitimizing these histories of colonial violence. And these are approaches that neglect alternative histories, counter histories, so histories that would retrieve the agency of minoritized and marginalized subjects, in this case, revolutionaries who go on to meet with military defeat. So the book sets out to try and retrieve these counter histories through an ethnographic focus on revolutionary afterlives. And so, in doing so, the book gets to stand on the shoulders of giants. And some of those giants are the Omanis, who have been skirting official censorship and writing about the revolution in studies and blogs, retrieving that history. And also scholars, within and outside Oman. A landmark here is the work of historian Abdulrazak Takriti, retrieving the revolution and also contesting the hearts and minds thesis by showing the extent of counterinsurgency violence in defeating the revolution. And so, in those conversations, the book is making two interventions. So, this body of work has focused, as indeed most of revolution studies tends to focus on, what happens during the revolution. And that leads my book to make two interventions. The first is to take up an ethnographic perspective. So the first part of the book is an historical ethnography of the revolution and the counterinsurgency as a further way of drawing out revolutionary agency. And then the second intervention is that the book extends the timeline of analysis to include afterlives, so these lasting legacies after a revolution's military defeat. And so the second half of the book is a fieldwork-based ethnography that looks at kinship and everyday socializing and unofficial commemoration as some of the ways in which some, by no means all, but some former revolutionaries in Oman were reproducing revolutionary values of social egalitarianism. And so, in the light of these legacies, we can bring fresh perspectives to revolution studies. So, we can extend the temporality and spatiality of revolutionary agency to recognize how it continues to have impacts after a period of of revolutionary military defeat and during times of ongoing repression. And by recognizing those ongoing impacts, we can question a conventional dichotomy in revolution studies between failed and successful revolutions, because afterlives remind us that revolutions with a range of outcomes go on to have these lasting impacts. And we can also have new grounds for challenging the hearts and minds thesis about the counterinsurgency campaign. The reasons for questioning that are not just that campaign was extremely violent, but also from the point of view of afterlives, we can see that the counterinsurgency efforts to win over hearts and minds through distributing resources and welfare programs, etc., have at least for some Dafaris fallen short of erasing long-term engagement with revolutionary values. And so by taking up afterlives to retrieve revolutionary agency and its ongoing impacts and to challenge the legitimization of counterinsurgency violence, the book, and this is a short quotation, is trying to be an effort towards decolonizing narratives of revolution and counterinsurgency. So those are some of the debates and ideas and interventions that the book is seeking to bring to the conversation. These are some other sources, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing with Omar and to hearing your questions.
Okay, Omar, I would like to invite you now to be in conversation with Alice. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much to you, Mona and Shana and Christian, and to the university for hosting. And it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here to discuss such a wonderful book, and a person and a remarkable topic. I mean, I personally have a personal interest as well in the Dhufar Revolution, as many of people who I consider friends in Bahrain were took part in the Dhufar Revolution, and I personally as well. When who you mentioned, Dr. Abdulrazak Takriti, when he was doing his research for his book, I accompanied him to Dhufar back in 2006, 2007 when he was doing the research. So yeah, I also have this personal vested interest in it, and I thought I'd begin with that to ask you, Alice, is what brought you to the topic of taking up the topic of the Dhufar Revolution and its afterlives. You previously worked on the Sahrawi liberation movement, and then this book is on the Dhufari liberation movement. So yeah, well, how did you come to this research this topic and the book?
Well, as we know, one revolution can lead to another. And indeed, it was from this long-standing interest in revolutionary projects of social change and state building that I came to the Dhufar Revolution. So when I was finishing the dissertation phase of the first project and thinking of what could a second project look like, I was interested in reversing the question from Western Sahara of how did a revolution keep going over several decades there. And Oman seemed to be a very interesting context to reverse that question, to think, well, what happens, for a revolution that had such depth and breadth to its ambitions for social transformation, but that meets with military defeat? What could survive from that in those conditions? And as we know, it can take many, many long years of journeys to bring projects to fruition. And so, on the course of applying for money for that, eventually doing fieldwork in 2015, the years writing up the book, that project came to take on other meanings by addressing these questions of that are increasingly relevant for broader cohorts within the Southwest Asia and North Africa region, for revolutionaries who've met with deep disappointments of what can survive of those aspirations when they find themselves living under the very kind of government that they were contesting. So that was a journey that brought me to happily to the far.
Great. Yeah, I mean, so from the title from the book, there are kind of two critical temporal axes around which the book is built. One is the revolution, which takes us back to the 60s and 70s, and what you call an officially silenced revolution. And the second is the afterlives, which is more in the contemporary period, and you define as a continuing influence, a later stage of life with a plurality of afterlives. And indeed, the book moves between the time period of the revolution and the contemporary era. So could you talk more about this afterlives of officially silenced revolution and how these two temporal episodes converse with each other across the contemporary and the past?
So the book is indeed trying to have a conversation and see, what are these connections between these two time periods. And so that first more historical ethnographic part is looking at some archival sources, historiographical accounts, and also some memories that people shared with me during my fieldwork. And then, the latter part drawing on the fieldwork in 2015. And the your question, beautifully raises the issue of when does the revolution become an officially silenced revolution? Because what I'm trying to convey by that term, which could be quite clumsy, but I was trying to avoid some potential pitfalls of alternative terms such as defeated revolution, because I think that didn't capture the range of perspectives that people had, and we might talk more about how some of the Dhafaris, don't accept that they were defeated in that revolution. So I was trying to avoid some other terms, but of course, it's when the Omani government takes the position to erase this revolution from official historical narratives, and it's not the only episode of dissent and government violent to repress it that the Omani government erases, but that reconfiguring of the public official discourse, produces this officially silenced revolution. So for those who may be familiar with Oman or new to it, if you pick up a history textbook in Oman or go to a museum in Oman, they just won't mention that this revolution happened at all. And so that context of that official silence raised many methodological and ethical dilemmas for this research project, which we might talk more about. But I think that the afterlives of revolution, that, as your question has raised, they're really intimately interconnected with official silence, because it's in the context of this official silence that afterlives become especially poignant, precisely because they're one of the ways of at least recognizing and acknowledging this episode that's being omitted from official histories. But I think that afterlives are also broader than an empirical context of official silence. So if I think, for instance, of the contemporary context in Egypt under President Sisi, many former revolutionaries there, or perhaps some of them consider themselves to still be revolutionaries, but are living under the rule of a government that has many close resemblances with one that they contested, but it's not the same kind of official silence. In fact, it's quite significant in the discourses of the Egyptian government to recognize the revolution as a threat to which President Sisi is providing solutions, as it were. But afterlives of revolution, I think, definitely would be a condition there, and we see that from the work of people working with Egyptians in post-revolutionary Egypt, and there are longer, lasting impacts in various aspects of their lives too. So afterlives, I hope, are also bigger than this particular context of official silence in Oman.
Yeah, as you said, kind of the book in the beginning deals with the revolutionary period and then brings in conversation with the current period. So if we begin and go back a bit in time to the revolutionary period, you're in your chapter 2, you turn your focus on what you call the messiness of social change during the time of the revolution, and the focus here is on detailing the egalitarian and counter-hegemonic tendencies and hopes that the revolution sought to establish, but also that these were fraught with contradictions. Indeed, you adopt complexity and messiness as an analytic framework to approach these social changes. So, yeah, if you could tell us more about why it was important to detail these egalitarian and counter-hegemonic tendencies within the revolution and the quote, the messiness within them.
Yes. So this revolution, like many that also took inspiration from Marxist-Leninist ideas and Maoist ideas, had very broad ambitions for radical social change, to try and promote egalitarianism, challenging long-term forms of social hierarchy. So particularly in this context, around social status of free privileged groups that intersects with gender, racialized identities, uh, enslaved persons, dependent persons, gender, and so some examples of concrete measures that the revolution was trying to pursue to try and create a different kind of society. For instance, they introduced measures to democratize access to key economic and political resources. So, for instance, water resources are really important in the subsistence economy that was dominant in Dhufar before the revolution, with much reliance on mobile pastoralism. And high-ranking tribes would have had priority access for those resources, and the revolution was saying water resources should be available for everybody. The revolution was opening up certain activities that were prestigious activities like bearing arms to previously excluded groups like enslaved persons, dependent persons, women. And so the book draws out these kinds of egalitarian and counter-hegemonic ambitions for various reasons. And I'll try and address three now. One is that these egalitarian tendencies are what makes the social change projects of the revolution distinctive from rival social change projects of the counterinsurgency, and that Zalmal's work has flagged to us so significantly. Colonialism is so often working through this colonial gaze and divide and rule policies, and the counterinsurgency policies were deliberately trying to offer resources according to different tribal groups to foment rivalries and tensions between tribes. And so it's in that detail of the fact that the roads, the wells, the schools, the health services that each of the counterinsurgency and the revolution eventually over time offer is in the ethnographic detail of the egalitarian or more tribalizing tendencies that we can see very clearly those projects are not interchangeable. A second reason is that those values around social egalitarianism are the very kinds of values that were coming up again in the daily lives of research participants in the fieldwork in 2015. And so they populate the second half of the book. And so to bring out that continuity, obviously I wanted to address that in the earlier half. And then a third reason is to bring out this idea of messiness. And so, of course, we have wonderful historical work that's already charted the egalitarian tendencies and projects of the revolution. We've got eyewitness accounts. And so what my book was trying to bring out as a theme in returning to that is what I end up calling the idea of messiness. And by that, to stress, I don't mean an idea of chaos. I mean to suggest as an antonym of neatness, to suggest the idea that even though revolutions present themselves with very clear discourses of teleology, of heading towards a particular kind of progressive outcome, that actually the direction of social change for participants isn't towards a preordained conclusion. Hence this idea of messiness, of not being one neat direction of travel. And I want to dwell on that, not to suggest that the messiness is the moment of pathology, as if that's the time when the revolution went wrong because it didn't offer the right things, or people didn't want what the revolution offered, because we see them making their own choices and negotiations of different forms of revolutionary change. Rather, I think that the messiness is a chance where we can see how people were really engaging in revolutionary change, making choices and adaptations that were meaningful for them. And that in the light of then a project that's trying to understand afterlives and how do they come about, messiness offers us a framework for understanding some of the qualities of revolutionary social change that lay foundations for the possibility of lasting legacies that will persist even in the face of the military defeat and the kinds of repression that former revolutionaries have faced in Oman. And so I hope that messiness can actually be part of the way we extend revolution studies to think not just about what are the qualities of revolutionary social change, but what are the qualities that lay lasting foundations for future legacies despite severe adversity.
Mm. I mean, you raise several points there. I mean, so staying in the period of the revolution, and in your subsequent chapter, you shift the focus from social change to spatial transformation, and both by the revolution, but also the counterinsurgent state. So you just talked a bit about how the counterinsurgent state used some divide and rule strategies like increased tribalization and the reliance on patronage to manipulate political loyalties and the intensification of conflicts over land and resources. But you also talk about how the state uses welfare provision, intelligence, propaganda, and the recruitment of local fighters as well to make up the political dimensions. But you also stress the conventional military tactics and how these led to spatial transformation. So, what are the connections between these spatial transformations during this revolutionary era by the counterinsurgent state and the afterlives that followed?
There are many connections between the afterlives and those spatial transformations. And your question was a wonderful invitation to reflect on that. So, on the one hand, the spatial transformations during the counterinsurgency period are trying to erase the revolution in very direct ways in terms of physically removing people from places where they could support revolutionaries. So clear and hold tactics of, say, Awadi or other areas where there's revolutionary activity. So forcibly displacing people en masse into areas where they could be under closer government control. And then over time, so typically to the coast or the plain where there's a stronger government presence and fewer of the challenges that the mountain terrain presented for the counterinsurgency attempts to control. And then over time, these spatial transformations also take on physical infrastructure forms, such as building roads that can give access into the mountains to prevent future or make it easier to more so that it might be quicker to put down future descent, as it were, but also building schools, healthcare clinics. So there's a physical infrastructure of a spatial transformation that comes over time and that continues after the official war period. And That kind of physical infrastructure is part of the arrival of what Omanis call the Nahda, the awakening or the renaissance of Oman, and the typical narratives present that as a personal gift from Sultan Qaboos to Omanis, as if it's a personal gift from him to bring them development. And so I think Afterlives intersect with this in two ways. First of all, the fact that the afterlives are there at all in people, reproducing some revolutionary values in their later lives shows that that project trying to raise the revolution was not fully, was never fully complete. But then secondly, that story of the infrastructure and the bringing of development to Oman, that official narrative of the personal gift from Sultan Qaboos doesn't recognize how actually who was doing that labor in Dhufar. As we were discussing, the Dhafaris who'd been close to counterinsurgency welfare projects had been exposed to tribalizing policies. And I learned from a former early post-war development worker, the British scholar Miranda Morris, who explained to me that, so she was working in that field in Dhufar in the early post-war period, who was actually doing that work in those projects. In the vast majority, they were former pupils of the revolutionary schools, and they were willing to work in those projects precisely because they were still engaged with the revolutionary value of the common good, al-maslaha al-amma, whereas Dhafaris who'd been closer to counterinsurgency projects were unwilling to work in development projects that would benefit tribes other than their own. So the actual nuts and bolts of delivering this physical infrastructure in the Dhafari context also relied on people still drawing on distinctive revolutionary values as these former pupils were. And that's one of the kinds of retrieval of revolutionary agency into the post-war period that the book is trying to foreground.
Yeah, well, that leads us into the second part of the book, where now the focus is looking at how the afterlives manifested during the contemporary period, or let's say after the revolution. And so you look at different ways this has manifested or worked through it. And the first of these that you focus is on social networks, and specifically kinship, which you look at as a collectivity of persons connected through shared experiences and potentially shared values. And specifically, you talk about how through post-war kinship, it emerges that post-war kinship can also reproduce social relations that came into being during the revolution. So I mean, you talked about a bit of them, but maybe now we can expand a bit more on how did these kinships in Dhufar reflect such revolutionary afterlives?
So here, the book is in conversation with a field in conflict and post-conflict literature in which kinship has played a significant role around the question of how do people try and retrieve the normal life that conflict disturbed. And there's been some very prominent studies that have made convincing arguments that kinship can be a key way that people try and reconnect and retrieve the normal life that conflict has disturbed. And as you explained, kinship can be very broad in meaning for anthropologists, but I also look at the idea of more literal forms of kinship, of how people understand that they're related to one another, such as through marriage, but also by naming people after people significant to them. So what I wanted to bring to that conversation from the conflict post-conflict literature about kinship was to recognize absolutely that can be a very important concern for people of how do they try and retrieve a normal life, but it's not the only concern and not the only way that they can turn to kinship. So absolutely, people did talk to me in Dhufar about kinship being an opportunity for a kind of retrieval of a version of social relations that the revolution had disrupted. And the way that people talked to me about that was especially gendered. It was around the idea of former female participants in the revolution returning to post-war Oman and family members marrying them off to other family members in order to sort of reintegrate them into kinship norms that had once again become more conservative in the post-revolutionary and post-war context. So that we do find in the VAR that element of kinship to try and retrieve a normality that the conflict has disrupted. But I also, over the course of fieldwork, learned from former revolutionaries that there were other opportunities through kinship for keeping these connections across groups of people who might otherwise not have normally been expected to be connected. So, for instance, marriage is an example there. Before the revolution, and then again after the revolution, the conventional marriage patterns are that it would be people, a man and a woman of a similar social status, or potentially a man of higher social status marrying a woman of lower social status, but not the reverse, not that a woman of higher social status would marry a man of lower social status. And those became some of the iconic revolutionary marriages because the revolution was encouraging those kinds of marriages as a kind of statement of one national identity and equality between what had previously been hierarchically distinct groups. And so, the prolongation of those marriages where the couple, stayed together in itself was a way of, bringing, um, you know, keeping those kinds of socially inclusive connections active into this post-revolutionary period. And some people would discuss those marriages with me and point them out to me. So they were distinctive for other Dhafaris. But even if the marriage didn't last for whatever reason, for death or divorce, where they'd produced children, those children then had unusual social maps of their own kinship relations. And there are instances in the book where other Dhafaris could recognize that from particular social scenarios. And I mentioned about naming. So sometimes people would name children born in the post-war period after significant revolutionary figures, both Dhafari figures from the revolution and also international figures like Rosa Luxemburg. So kinship was one of these ways in this context of official silence that some former revolutionaries were keeping up these socially inclusive connections. And what I wanted to draw out from that was the idea that the role of kinship in a post-conflict scenario can be very, very broad and also can include efforts, subtly and not in ways that I don't argue that they're forms of resistance of concern to the Omani government. And, I never saw any evidence of that, but nevertheless, they are ways that are prolonging, they're not trying to get back to the pre-conflict normality. They're prolonging the fragile social relations that came into being, in this case, through a period of revolution.
Yeah, I mean, and so then so one after the kinship, then you move on to explore the, as you call them, the everyday and the extraordinary, and how the afterlives manifest through the everyday and the extraordinary, through everyday socializing, other quotidian interactions that some Dhavari revolutionaries would use to reproduce values of social egalitarianism. So, as you say, these values continue to challenge Dhafar's gendered, tribal, and status group and racialized hierarchies. So, how did this manifest in terms of the everyday and the extraordinary?
Mm. So I'll just add that these groups of people who were coming together across conventional social differences, these people who had former revolutionary backgrounds, were, as you say, challenging Dhafari local hierarchies, but also challenging national hierarchies that are at the heart of a patron-client um, governance sort of mapping of relations between the governor, the ruler, in this case, very personalized sultan, and the different distinctive and hierarchically ranked amongst themselves constituencies of governed persons. So, those kinds of hierarchies between ruler and client groups, and within and between client groups, are absolutely inherent to a patron-client, rentier state such as Oman. And so, these forms of everyday socializing that were socially inclusive were also challenging to those national hierarchies. But I should stress that there's a subtlety there in the sense that the former revolutionaries were also part of those hierarchies. Everybody would, lead me to understand that they are also co-opted subjects. But what I wanted to try and bring out was the idea that being part of those networks of cooptation does not preclude that they can also draw on these other areas of life to reproduce dissonant values of social egalitarianism. So to give you some idea of what that actually looked like in practice, so one example amongst male former revolutionaries was that there was a group of them who met every night in public in the same place, in the street, in Dhufar, which was a common habit of adult men to leave the family home and meet in friendship groups in urban settings like the main city, Salalah. But the other groups, and I was fortunate to be able to visit several groups, they would bring together people who shared one social background. And what was distinctive about the former revolutionaries is that they brought together people, men, from free and historically unfree statuses, mountain and town settled backgrounds, uh, people who um, were speakers of modern South Arabian languages and Arabic, and that was very, very distinctive. That was very unusual. One example of these kind of extraordinary acts. So, as I mentioned, for those male gatherings, that kind of male gathering didn't have much potential for challenging everyday segregation between men and women because these are all male gatherings. And so, one of the ways that people drew my attention to, a kind of echo of uh, a revolutionary interest in promoting gender egalitarianism is a woman who stood for election for the National Consultative Council in Oman. And very few women from Dhufar have ever stood for election. But this woman was distinctive amongst even that small group because of her social background, which was a high ranking background. And those are precisely the women whose tribes would prefer them not to have their name and face circulate in public because of the reputation of the tribe at stake, at least in understandings of that. And so that's an example of how the everyday has its limits to try and challenge prevailing norms. Sometimes an extraordinary act might be necessary, but bringing those two into conversation, one of the things that strikes me is that just as anthropologist Jessica Winiger has written in the context of the Egyptian revolution about the privilege of revolution, how participating in revolution can rely on gendered and class privilege in order to actually be there in the spaces that are usually recognized as iconic revolutionary spaces. We can see that male privilege of being able to access male space in public, that was one of the privileges that allowed these men to do their socially inclusive socializing. But in the case of the woman who stood for election, that woman had founded and ran her own business, so she couldn't be sacked from either a government job or a private sector job. So she also had a class privilege. And so those, tracing those patterns brought out to me how the afterlives of revolution can also rely on intersectional forms of privilege, and they're not equally desirable or equally available for all former revolutionaries.
Yeah, the last then chapter you look at specifically commemoration of the revolution as parts of the afterlives of revolution, and specifically at how revolutionaries commemorate the revolution, but within a setting where official commemoration is obviously banned by the state. So how did these commemorations take shape, and why were they important for revolutionaries and their kins in the aftermath of revolution?
So these are there's a whole range of things I talk about in the chapter, but I'm just going to focus here on two instances, which I think are more explicitly commemorative. But I also think that in the context of this official silence, there was some quite creative repurposing of things like jokes that, possibly could be a subtle form of commemoration. I'm going to talk for now about something that I think is more directly recognizable as commemorative. So one is funeral attendance, very, very wide funeral attendance from former revolutionaries when another former revolutionary passes away, across the kinds of differences of, say, so funeral attendance is gender segregated. So when I talk about a male attending a woman's funeral, he will attend the male gathering to mourn for that woman. But what I came to understand is that that kind of attendance would be quite unusual if there wasn't a kinship relation with someone from the opposite sex. But for former revolutionaries, they very, very widely attended the funerals of male and female former revolutionaries across those kinds of differences. So again, this social inclusivity coming forward again. But another aspect was that, so former revolutionaries remained, some of them, in southern Yemen until the 1990s as a community of political exiles. And they returned to Oman over the decades from the 70s to the 90s. Some actually returned in 2015 during my time there during the conflict in Yemen. But focusing for now on those earlier decades, people in Dhufar would welcome them with a sort of ritual hosting, istiqbal. And that is one way that it raises these questions. So to come to the second part of your question, why is this important? This is harder to answer because we're used to commemoration having very clear meanings of the kind of collective identity that people are commemorating. And in these
Mm,
kinds of declare events that people described to me, I think it was very ambiguous. Were people commemorating a revolutionary life, the return of somebody, with whom they had these revolutionary connections, or were they celebrating the return of a kind of prodigal figure coming back to the fold? And I think
mm,
also, I didn't attend one of these events myself. People did talk to me about them, but people would also sort of be shy about wanting to go into too much detail. For instance, where people said they'd seen a WhatsApp video of one, when I said, "Oh, do you still have the video?" Absolutely not. People, would draw back. And so I'm not absolutely sure what it meant for former revolutionaries. But I think from what I take from that is that maybe we can learn more about commemoration if we don't set as a criterion that we have to know exactly what people are commemorating, and that would extend us to be able to recognize commemoration could look, at unofficial, outside this, very, very prominent national culture of commemoration in Oman that's Sultan centric. And I think that even if I, hesitate to try and suggest what it means for former revolutionaries and their family members, I think it's very important for people who are trying to understand revolution and, within memory studies to recognize those forms of unofficial commemoration, partly because the revolution itself, like other revolutionary movements that, saw themselves as running an, a- unrecognized state authority, that revolution invested heavily in its own forms of commemoration. And the official silence afterwards seems to suggest, well, did that official commemoration in revolutionary times just disappear? And so by recognizing unofficial commemoration, we can at least recognize that official earlier revolutionary commemoration, naming the revolutionary school after revolutionary figures or naming a health clinic after a revolutionary martyr, all of that doesn't just disappear. It has its own kind of afterlife, I'm arguing, in this unofficial commemoration. And then a second reason is that that gives us some purchase for doing more of this work of retrieving revolutionary agency. Because the conventional narratives about that national commemorative culture in Oman that is Sultan Qaboos centric are to say that Sultan Qaboos, having trained in Britain with the British military, enjoyed pomp and circumstance, and he was really into commemoration, also had a legitimacy deficit because of the circumstances of his coming to power through a British organized coup against his father. And all of that is very much relevant. But it seems to me also that just as we saw rival projects for social change, the counterinsurgency was facing a rival project of commemoration when the previous Sultan, Sultan Said, hadn't had a national culture of commemoration at all. And in fact, some of the memoirs from British personnel, you can read them against the grain and draw out from that some former revolutionaries who changed side from the revolution to the counterinsurgency were suggesting ideas from revolutionary commemoration to be repurposed for the counterinsurgency, such as naming military brigades after key figures. And so, actually, I think I want to bring in another ingredient to what's the genealogy of the official commemoration culture in Oman as we know it, being focused on the Sultan, that in addition to the other kinds of reasons that are to do with the Sultan and his position, that actually there's this deeper history of an alternative revolutionary official commemoration that also contributed to the urgency of the beginnings of the official commemoration we know today. So that's also part of what the book is trying to do: retrieve that revolutionary agency for within commemoration.
yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, we could keep going. I'll just, but I think, yeah, I'll just ask one more question, and it's related to what you just ended on. And in fact, I'll do it through a quote of that you say in the book, which is about how the narratives about each of the counterinsurgency and the revolution are viewed by their by their, I guess, protagonists. So you say, quote, recognition of the afterlives of revolution, and especially those of an officially silenced revolution, destabilizes polarizing accounts about the aftermath of both revolution and counterinsurgency. Conventional narratives posit putatively definitive endings, either of success or of failure and defeat. As concerns the far, there are rival but similarly polarizing accounts where, end quote, where many Dhafaris say they won the war. Dhafari revolutionaries would say they won the war, while the official narrative is that the Al Nahda modernization by Qaboos and the British won hearts and minds. So it seems to me it was important for you in this book to interrogate and move beyond these two polarizing views through Afterlife. So yeah, why and how so?
Um, I'll just say a little bit more about the Dhafaris believing they won the war, because it might need a
Yeah.
little bit more explanation for those newer to the Dhafari context. So um, this is not a new view. We find it from studies reporting from the late 1970s, and it's also known in the north of Oman. We find it in reports from people who took part in the Arab uprising demonstrations in the north of Oman, talking to other researchers, talking about how Dhafaris won their revolution. So it's well known within Oman, even if it can't be part of the official story, but perhaps less known outside Oman. And it refers to the idea that because the revolution was a serious threat, it pushed the British to organize a coup to remove Sultan Saeed, whom they came to see as an obstacle to them achieving their goals, put in place Sultan Qaboos, and adopt a developmentalist agenda that was going to rival the developmentalist agenda that the revolution was calling for. So causing a massive direction in the change of state. I mean, we could talk more about that in terms of kind of rival visions of colonialism and its ideas about development. But that's partly what the thesis of Dhafaris won the war is talking about. So to go back briefly to the hearts and minds thesis of this resounding victory for a campaign that successfully won hearts and minds, absolutely the book wants to contest and interrogate that. It's erasing and legitimizing colonial violence. We can see here this version of Gayatri Spivak, where here it's a version of white men, the counterinsurgency, British officers and personnel, saving brown men and women from other brown men and women, in this case, communists. And it's a white savior narrative in the hearts and minds thesis. And we have to, contest these colonial tropes that are erasing and legitimizing colonial violence and erasing and delegitimizing the resistance of colonized subjects. And so that's what the book is trying to do when it talks about decolonizing narratives about revolution and counterinsurgency. But on the other hand, the book, whilst it wants to acknowledge and try and avoid a straightforward language of defeated revolution, precisely because some Dhafaris don't identify with that and they see that they won that revolution, but also to take some distance from that narrative. And some of the former revolutionaries I was able to speak with about that, when you pushed them, they recognized that they didn't win everything. They didn't win democracy. They didn't win republicanism. So they did, when pushed, reflect critically that they didn't win everything that they were standing for. And so it's important, I think, not to try and romanticize the revolution or its achievements, and to take polarizing narratives as ethnographic objects in their own right. It can tell us a lot about the agendas of the people voicing them. So, for instance, for some former revolutionaries, in some ways, I see them as claiming that they want they want to be recognized within national narratives of the progress in the Dhufar, and Oman nationally, but recognizing the revolution as contributing to that rather than erasing it. So it's not necessarily a totally dissonant narrative to some of the dominant narratives, but I see some of them of wanting recognition within that. And so I think one thing that Afterlives invites us to think about is that either of those polarizing narratives that posit these definitive endings of victory or defeat can fully capture these ongoing legacies that are they're often ambiguous, but these impacts are ongoing and they don't quite fit either of those polarizing narratives. So I hope that's something that Afterlives can also bring to the table.
Great. Yeah. I mean, we can keep going with the questions, but I think, yeah, we'll open them up now for any questions that we have or discussions that people want to, interventions that they would like to do. We have one question here, which is from Ian Drummond, who asks, what are the chances of the afterlives of revolution eventually being reflected in the political system itself? So he says, in terms of, as an example, in terms of military defeat and official erasure, I'm thinking of the Greek Civil War and eventual punishment of what had been the main anti-Nazi resistance, unique in Europe as a parallel, where the left did eventually emerge into legal politics and even government, of course. So that's one question. And then the other one was, relatedly, why didn't it re-emerge in the Arab Spring when Oman was seen as a beacon of stability, ongoing legacy of the defeat and counterinsurgency?
Thank you for great questions. So the first question is, you know, I wish I had the answer to that, but I think it's a broader question than I feel equipped to answer. But I can say that for the Omani context, in a sense, part of what was so powerful about the counterinsurgency is its capacity to co-opt key members of the revolution who went on to have ministerial portfolios for Sultan Qaboos. So in a sense, some of that pattern that that question spoke to has already happened in Oman, but has been completely encased in the official narratives of Sultan Qaboos's project of modernization for the country. On the second question, I would love that person to, if they would like to, send me an email and I can be in touch and share some sources on this. So there were Arab uprising demonstrations in Oman in 2011, and some of the longest lasting were in Dhufar. And some of the demonstrators, I've read from other people's research, called out slogans there that referred back to the 1970s and positioned them as protesters in the present as the grandchildren of free men. I unfortunately didn't have the opportunity myself to do research to unpack with people what that could have meant more broadly. But absolutely, there were Arab uprising demonstrations in the far, and if you would like to read more of the book, in the conclusion, I address that in the book, looking at how we can see in those protests in the far similar values from one that we once saw in the revolution resurfacing in those Arab Spring protests, collective organizing around common grievances beyond questions of tribal and other forms of ethnic difference. And some of the bloggers who were documenting those protests, and that's where I got the information from, are blogging about that at the time. So I absolutely see that those revolutionary values that, to stress again, in the kinship, the everyday socializing, and the unofficial commemoration, all those everyday things, there was no indication to me that these things happening in public were things that the Omani government found to have resistance of concern. That the Arab uprisings would be a different category. And there, I argue that we do see these revolutionary values re-emerging there, but the government definitely saw that as resistance of concern. And how that ended is with the bringing in of tanks into the streets of Salalah. And again, bloggers from the FAR have written about that, about how painful that was for them, because for all kinds of reasons, and hundreds of people were arrested. But it brought back very bitter memories of the 1960s, 1970s war, in which at the beginning there were no Dhufaris at all in armed forces fighting for the Sultan, because the Sultan didn't originally recruit Dhufaris into the Sultan's armed forces. And so people experienced that earlier war as an army of occupation. And paramilitaries who were recruited in the 1970s, I learned during my fieldwork, those brigades still exist and they're now staffed by relatives of the original recruits, but they were not called in immediately to address these Arab Spring protests. And that's a piece of writing I need to, generate the time to get on and write and publish. But, so it definitely left a bitter taste for many people in the FAR, that the way that the Arab Spring demonstrations were brought to an end there felt like an echo of bringing in an army in which the presence of local people was not prominent.
Thanks, Alice. Ian actually also put his email in the chat box, so he'd appreciate it if you could. Yeah, that would be great. If you could send him. The next question we've got is, elsewhere you discuss that revolutionary participants have different degrees of privilege when it comes to reproducing revolutionary values. Can you give us some examples of this that you encountered in your fieldwork?
Yes. So some of it is what I very briefly began to speak about earlier. So this idea of male privilege, that men can sit out in the street and socialize, that women don't have that unstigmatized privilege in the FAR. They do get together and socialize, but in enclosed spaces. And in those spaces that I was invited to visit, or that people talked to me about, it tended to be around kinship connections between women. Nobody mentioned to me that former female revolutionaries were also doing these kinds of socially inclusive gatherings. They might have been doing it, but nobody drew that to my attention. So that would be one, this idea of a male privilege, that men can meet in public in ways that aren't open to women. And then another instance would be of the woman who, put herself out there facing backlash when she stood for election, and key male members of her family faced backlash as well. It being suggested that they were in some way also failing if she was putting herself out there. And uh, as I say, this person had a lot of class privilege because that woman ran her own business, so nobody could sack her from that business. And this is discussed in chapter 5 in the book. There's more a longer story there, but this woman was also very personally closely connected to the Sultan, and Sultan. The way people explained it to me is that Sultan, whose mother is from Dhufar, was from Dhufar, so he has very strong connections in Dhufar, who knew about the backlash that this woman and her family were facing, and eventually intervened to personally meet her and send a public message of that the backlash against her should stop. And so that kind of privilege, of the class privilege of running your own business and personal connection to the Sultan, were not available to all the Faris. And as I say, very few women have done that kind of extraordinary action of standing for election. But I think that, at least in that case, we can see there's a form of class privilege that gave her some buffer. I'm sure that the backlash must have, had its impacts, but she had some buffer to face it.
Next question we've got is from Ilana Feldman, who says, among the many things that struck me was you're highlighting the centrality of social change projects with different visions of the future in both revolutionary and counterinsurgency practices. Can you say more about infrastructure as part of the messy afterlife of revolution?
It's a fantastic question. Thank you. So I wish I could say more about this, but let's start with what I can say. In fact, there's a wonderful instance of messiness that I can refer to. So part of the project to depopulate the mountains as the area that had been the core heartland of support for the revolution involved distributing land and offering housing to people in the central plain, which is around what's become the main city, Salalah. And there's a geographer who did a study in the late 1970s, and he's the one from whose work I'm drawing to tell this story. But he tells it sort of with a different purpose in mind. But what he notes is that at a certain point, there's a project for a new infrastructure that the state is going to build, for which they will have to clear people away from some of these houses that they've been allocated. And at this stage, it's important to say the houses were quite simple, very high density occupation, probably one room for a multi-generational family. But nonetheless, those might still have felt to be very important accommodations from the perspective of the people involved. Some of the British people writing about them are quite disparaging about it, but we can't be sure that that was the Dhufari perspective. And indeed, some of these people were so unwilling to vacate these homes, even though they were offered other homes elsewhere, that they, it's reported in this book, they burned the home. They were then put into tents, and they burned those down, and then they, retreated to the mountains. And so that's just one small insight into the kind of fraught tensions around these projects of infrastructure, and that the projects of the state and its vision for what it would bring in didn't necessarily coincide with people's own aspirations. Perhaps something else that I'm just thinking. I suppose that maybe one important thing to say is that there's another kind of messy afterlife of this infrastructure, because one of the things that happened during the war is that there was heavy mining, both sides laid mines, but also there were fences set up in the mountains to progressively curtail access to food supplies for the revolutionaries. And that was a key technique for eventually the military defeat of the revolution, not only for their military supplies, but also their food supplies. And again, one thing I kind of stumbled across, again, sort of rereading memoirs against the grain, was a British veteran visiting, several decades after the end of the war, and commenting that people are sort of recycling this wire for making animal pens. And I also read that in a very different way, of kind of the sort of the horror of thinking these are mobile pastoralists. They need mobility to move around with their animals, but the kind of the infrastructure of the war has just been left there, and has undoubtedly caused somebody had to go in there and just pull these things up, and some of them have been recycled, but they must undoubtedly have caused many obstacles along the way. So I think there's an in addition to the official story of bringing all this infrastructure to bring modernization, there's also the signs that people had to, at some point, they didn't identify with what that was providing for them. They were resisting, or they just had to kind of get on with recycling the detritus of war themselves. And there's also another kind of complication to the infrastructure story, which is the FAR now has a container port, a busy container port,
Mm.
but the Faris believe that it was delayed for many years in its opening, and they believe that that was because there was discomfort at the national level about the possibility of providing the Faris with economic infrastructure that might feed into any resurgence of an independence movement there. And so even though some people that I've come to understand, some northerners see Dhufar as a kind of land of bounty, that it's been lots and lots of flows of resources there in order to win over hearts and minds. The Faris themselves are not always convinced of that, and feel that they may have been denied some things because of their political history. So those are some thoughts on infrastructure. Thank you for a great question.
Great, thank you very much. I think I can now maybe ask a few more of questions from my side as well. I mean, I think maybe we'll actually we've got one more question here. Let me do that before that. So, given you've written two books about liberation movements, can you reflect a bit about the relevance of your findings to making sense of the post 2011 Arab revolutions and counter revolutions?
Thank you. So I think that one of the main findings from my first project is that, if you like, the creativity of revolutions and the innovation within revolutions to draw on existing social relations, in that case, for the purpose of building revolutionary state power and trying to keep radical social change going. And what that first project found in some cases is that, as you would imagine, at that time, it had been 40 years of exile. Some
Mm.
forms of revolutionary change kind of fell by the wayside and didn't prove as long lasting as others. And the ones that I found that proved very long lasting were drawing on pre existing forms of social relations. So, forms of labor pooling that Sahrawi tribes have been doing, that were then kind of relabeled, reconstituted, and sort of recycled into revolutionary labor pooling. And that kept going even into the age when people began to be expected to be paid for work for the revolution, but they still kept volunteering for things like that. So I think that that is one of the possible broader points of interest for the post 2011 panorama in Swana, which is that there will be all kinds of experiences in these revolutions that may not yet be clear how they can be recycled and reused in the future, but that future generations may well find those possibilities. And that even though revolutions anchor themselves in narratives of rupture and change, it's not necessarily a drawback for a revolution to embed itself in meaningful, locally meaningful forms of social organization, transforming them along the way. So in that Sahrawi case, the pre-revolutionary labor pooling was along tribal lines, but the revolutionary labor pooling brings people together across those differences. So
Mm.
there's been a transformation. So being open-minded about what is it that we can retrieve from these revolutionary experiences, and how can we embed them so that they can become long-lasting despite many obstacles. So that would be from the first project. And then in the second project, I think that this very idea that when people feel that in many ways they've lost everything in terms of the revolution, which is, I'm sure, how many Omanis and their fellow travelers, as Omar mentioned, there were people from other countries who worked very hard for this revolution. Even that feeling of having lost everything, that actually by living their lives to the extent that it's possible by the values that are meaningful for them, that can go on to have other kinds of impacts that cannot be foreseen at a given moment in time. So, for instance, to go back to my answer about the Arab uprisings in Salalah, those revolutionary values, such as in kinship or these funeral attendants that younger generations of the Faris knew about, some of them were describing that to me of older relatives. That so those revolutionary values weren't of concern to the government in those contexts of, say, kinship, but then when they reappear in these uprisings, then they do become part of a broader agenda for dissent. So even the small things, even the small things in a context of disappointment and repression go on to have big impacts at a future point. So they really matter. And I suppose anything that we can do, the people who are activists, but also fellow travelers such as scholars who are trying to work on these issues, anything that we can do to try and document what happened to save it from these erasures, provides resources for future generations. So I think that's something that's very relevant for the current post 2011 generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, maybe picking up on that. I mean, maybe we can talk a bit about kind of the ethnographic work and you doing the work and going to the far there. So you went and you conducted the ethnographic and field work in 2015, right? Which is so this was after the quote unquote Arab Spring and what the protests that happened in Oman in 2011, where there was for a period a bit of kind of opening up, but then it closed down a bit afterwards in 2012 and 2013. But it's still like, I mean, if I compare it to, I remember when we went, it was in 2006 or seven. So then it was, no one would talk about it, right? It was very, very difficult to kind of, it was still very closed up. So yeah, I just wanted for you to reflect on how was it kind of doing this work while you were there, and how were people kind of responsive, and how would you were you able to kind of approach it, especially given what we talked about it coming after 2011, or not, or what kind of the closure that came afterwards.
Thank you. It's also an opportunity for me to talk about some of the methodological dilemmas of working under
Mm.
authoritarianism, in which research participants have a much better understanding of how authoritarianism and surveillance works there. The risks that they face. So I was there for 5 months in 2015, and that for anthropology is a short time of fieldwork, but that length of fieldwork reflects the challenges of working in conditions of an authoritarian security state, where there's surveillance as a part of everyday life. I'd been to Oman in 2013 briefly, but I hadn't been before the Arab uprisings, so I don't have the benefit of the direct before and after myself. But from talking to other researchers, just as you mentioned, it seems that absolutely 2011 had a very big impact on, as people talk about, overcoming fear. And there were people who, especially younger people under the age of 40 at that time, so people who had not directly themselves experienced the counterinsurgency violence that former revolutionaries themselves had experienced, but their relatives, for instance, or a younger generation, they would sometimes begin talking to me in the language of tamarrud, uprising, which is or the government language, or rebellion. But then they would correct themselves and then say, well, the government calls it tamarrud, but I'm going to call it thawra. But former revolutionaries themselves much more rarely use the word thawra with me. They would talk about Gabha, the front, but I did feel that generational difference between the people who'd been firsthand in the counterinsurgency, feeling that. And of course, the former revolutionaries, according to accounts that various books mention, they sign papers when they come back to Oman, committing to be loyal subjects. So they're also under very, very strict constraints about what they can do or say. But I think there was an effect of the Arab uprisings, of at least in personal conversations, of people having, at least some younger people, having lost some of that fear. But it also was very difficult in that people would say to me, "Have you seen these kinds of websites? The websites that play revolutionary songs or mention revolutionary martyrs?" But nobody would show them to me themselves, as it were, so that they were very careful. They, or perhaps very naively, I would ask, "Does anybody remember any poetry from the revolution?" People would say, "No, absolutely not." But there's a Palestinian memoir of a Palestinian doctor who worked in the revolution that cites revolutionary poetry. So we can imagine that outside that context of official silence, people might, remember more, be able to say what they remember. So it was very difficult to meet female former revolutionaries, and I think that speaks to the often greater barriers that they faced on their return of stigma and scrutiny and expectation of conforming to conservative gender norms. And I did meet a few, but none of them wanted to talk directly about the revolution with me, and they would say, there's no benefit in that. So that was sort of one sort of shape of the field work, that I try and use some published sources to try and get around that, but it's one of the areas that my research could only go so far, and it wasn't really the kinds of conditions where I could collect from my positionality detailed life stories of former revolutionaries. Some of them did talk to me, but I very much hope that somebody else can do that work in the future, and so that also affected the kind of ethnography that I then wrote, very much about observing, everyday actions. And if you like, there's a sense in which some of those actions are speaking, as loudly maybe as words that another researcher might be able to collect. It was really important to let Omanis set the direction of the conversation, because they understood the conditions of surveillance much better than me. And so if somebody didn't want to talk directly about the revolution, then we didn't talk directly about it. Uh, um, I think it's also important to say that when I was writing the book, I was really trying to ask myself, am I revealing something that's sensitive in Oman that's not already known to the authorities who are surveilling Omanis? And if I thought that might be the case, then I didn't put it in the book. Um, and um, you know, uh, these were always very, very difficult decisions. A year after my fieldwork, an Omani journalist wrote on Facebook some references to the executed revolutionaries and Abdullah Habib, and then received a 3-year prison sentence, which was later commuted. But it really does give you an indication that there can be very real consequences for people in Oman for talking in ways about this revolution that pass the red line of what the government is prepared to allow.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we're running out of time a bit, but so I'll combine my last two questions, and they're, I guess since the book is about the past and the contemporary, maybe now we can talk a bit about the future. So the two parts were, one I was going to ask, are does the book have any afterlives for yourself? Are you still involved, or are you still doing work in Dhufar, and so what kind of connection or work is that taking? And then we can also maybe bridge it into what are your kind of your future or current projects that you're working on.
Thank you. There were always the bits that didn't fit in the book, and
Mm.
I would like to write this piece about the Arab uprisings in Salalah and
Mm.
the kind of ambiguous role of the, you know, kind of inheritors of the paramilitaries, um, and the fact that it seems that they were kept at bay while the protesters were physically occupying the space of protest. Trying to think through that. What does that say about the post-conflict status quo in Oman? What anxieties might it express? And I would also like to think more broadly about that in terms of, I focused here on the afterlives of the revolution, but, there's really afterlives of the counterinsurgency and the paramilitaries. And there could potentially be, more historical work to do around that. There's also some of the work about a short article in Merit that addresses some of the other progressive platforms for post-war politics around electoral leagues, but that were trying to get people elected who were from non-traditional backgrounds. And so I'd like to look more at that as this, parallel, emergence of a platform for progressive politics. And then more broadly, there was a beautiful question earlier about thinking comparatively across liberation movements. One thing I would really like to return to comparatively is the question of the abolitionist movements within these late 20th century Arab liberation movements. Both of these movements abolished enslavement when the colonial authorities that were operating in each context, both Spain and the UK, were either turning a blind eye to ongoing forms of enslavement or actually
Mm.
defending its ongoing presence and saying there wasn't a need to abolish enslavement, that being the case in Oman. And so these are movements that were standing up to European colonialism that was actually, sympathetic to ongoing enslavement. So I think that I would, love to do, a broader historical project to try and retrieve those histories of Arab abolitionism, because I think that for broader, certainly Anglophone audiences, that story isn't known enough yet.
Mm. Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, we'll have to end at that. I wish we could go on, but yeah, we'll leave it at that. And yeah, I'd urge everyone to follow on and read the book. But yeah, thank you very much, Alice, for that yeah, lovely conversation. And I'll hand it back to Muna.
Thank you, Omar. It was such a pleasure. Thank you to everybody for the questions.
Thank you, Alice and Omar, for such an interesting conversation. And Alice, congratulations on writing such a rich book. I believe Christian had put in the chat box an opportunity for people to purchase that book. So thank you so much. And the recording will be circulated. So for those of you who want to share the conversation, that should be coming in about a week's time. And just a reminder to please hopefully join us for the Gravitating Towards the Gulf IMUS Annual Conference, April 25th. Thank you so much to everyone for your attention today, and have a great day.